Saddle fore aft, saddle setback, saddle layback. On a standard saddle, the horizontal position can only be adjusted by a few centimetres. So how much does it really matter exactly where you place it? Today, I am diving in to why it is important to get your saddle setback right, particularly what happens and how to know if your saddle is too far forwards or too far backwards. This is a long video because it needs to be, so buckle up. There are so many different rationales for saddle fore aft positioning that frankly, it is a minefield. Expert opinion is sometimes consistent, sometimes it's contradictory, and sometimes the experts agree on what to do, but they have opposing reasons as to why they suggest it. I'm going to show you what the research says, critically review the most popular and prevalent schools of thought, and at the end of the video, summarise the information to show you the best method to get the optimal saddle fore aft placement for you. Sound good? Let's go. Saddle setback is a small part of a much bigger bike fitting process, and when optimised will offer the rider the benefits of superior power, efficiency and pedalling effectiveness, balanced muscle activation and contribution, minimised joint strain, minimised upper body loading, better saddle comfort, stability and control in all riding positions in and out of the saddle, and superior bike handling and manoeuvrability. How to measure saddle setback? First of all, let's define our terms. Saddle setback is the horizontal distance that the tip of the nose of the saddle is behind the centre of the bottom bracket. The easiest way to work this out is to balance your bike in an upright position so that the rear tyre is touching a wall. Then, keeping the bike still, measure the distance from the wall to the nose tip of the saddle, then subtract this from the measured distance of the wall to the centre of the bottom bracket. Already, we can see the first problem with this definition in that different length saddles will have different setback measurements, even if your pelvis is in exactly the same position behind the bottom bracket. For example, on a traditional 27 centimetre saddle, the setback will read 3 centimetres less than for a modern short nose power saddle at 24 centimetres, even though in reality your pelvis will end up in exactly the same spot. So, if you are using your setback measurement to install a new saddle on your bike, be aware of any saddle length difference. What techniques have been proposed to find the perfect saddle setback for a cyclist? KOPS, knee over pedal spindle. When I bought my first carbon drop bar road bike from my local bike shop about 10 years ago, this was a technique that they used to position my saddle horizontally. I sat on my brand new bike on an indoor trainer in the bike shop, and the mechanic held a plumb line to my forward knee, and he scrutinised exactly where the line dangled, and then he made small adjustments horizontally to the saddle until he got the position he was happy with. He told me that this was to prevent my knees from getting sore, and I was quite impressed with this because it seemed to be a very specific, scientific and accurate means to set the saddle position. Notable advocates of the KOPS method include Andy Pruitt in his book The Complete Medical Guide for Cyclists. When this book was published in 2006, Andy was the director of the Boulder Center for Sports Medicine in Colorado. He states that the saddle setback should put your knee's center of rotation directly above the pedal axle of the forward crank arm when it's horizontal. His method for this was to have the cyclist set up on an indoor trainer, do a warm-up for about 5 minutes, and then stop with the near side crank arm horizontal. He would then drop a plumb line from the front of the kneecap, and he wanted to see the line just touch the front tip of the crank arm. He noted that others suggest to drop the plumb line from the tibial tuberosity, which is a different part of the knee, and the line then was expected to cross the centre of the pedal spindle. However, as he rightly pointed out, some people have got quite lumpy tuberosities, and this would upset the final position. I've seen many experts and bike fit commentators commend the KOPS method, but more and more, the overwhelming majority, just ignore it. The bike component brand Bontrager, which is now owned by Trek, was started by Keith Bontrager, who was a motorbike racer, cyclist and bicycle frame builder. Many years ago, he published an article explaining that a cyclist's knee lining up with a pedal spindle is merely a coincidental relationship rather than a biomechanical ambition. He explained that if the relative joint angles of the leg, the saddle to bottom bracket distance, and the pedaling dynamics are all maintained, then it won't matter how far forwards or backwards the hips are relative to the bottom bracket. Furthermore, where the plumb line falls in relation to the pedal is entirely dependent on ground angle. If you are on an uphill slope, then the plumb line will fall well behind the pedal spindle. He also points out that recumbent bikes have a crank axle directly in front of the knees, not below the knees, and pedaling these is just as effective as a normal road bike. And we know that time trial and triathlon bikes invariably have a very steep seat post angle, therefore have a very forward saddle position, and the rider's knees will reach well forward of the pedal spindle. If a forward knee position caused knee injuries, then most time trialists and most triathletes would have these problems. Phil Burt has been the physio and bike fitter for Team Sky and Great Britain. In his 2014 book Bike Fit, he references and agrees with Bontrager's view on KOPS and also points out some practical limitations of this method due to movement of the plumb line and incorrect placement on the knee. He also says that static measures do not reflect dynamic positions while pedaling, which is a recurring theme in modern bike fitting. In the Bike Fit and Body Positioning chapter of the book Cycling Science, author Todd Carver agrees. He writes, the debate about KOPS exists as the anatomic and bike component points seem arbitrary and the plumb relationship changes with road angle. Many bike fitters point out that the KOPS method began as a bike sizing and frame building guide and should never have progressed to a bike fitting methodology. My quick take on KOPS: I've definitely used it in my bike fitting sessions and I think it provides some good general feedback on the overall bike position, but I do not get too wrapped up in it as there are other variables which are way more important. If we are prepared to accept that we need to look beyond KOPS for better methods to set saddle fore aft position, then there is a raft of research and commentary to wade through now. Warning: unfortunately, in many of the discussions about the effects of horizontal saddle movement, it is not made clear whether the relative distance from the bottom bracket to the saddle is being maintained. When moving the saddle forwards, this will shorten the distance to the bottom bracket, so in order to maintain the same joint angles across the pedal stroke, the saddle will need to be raised slightly. Similarly, when moving the saddle backwards, we will need to lower it slightly. I believe that most discussions only refer to horizontal saddle movement, so the effect of the new saddle position could be due to the change in fore and aft, could be due to the change in bottom bracket to saddle distance, or it could be both. I told you it was a minefield. What do the experts and the researchers say? One study titled Influence of Saddle Setback on Pedaling Technique Effectiveness in Cycling, dated 2016, showed that a backward saddle position offered greater pedaling effectiveness compared to a preferred or forward saddle position, i.e. there was less wasted mechanical work when pedaling at 200 watts. However, in his book, Phil Burt says that if the knees are too far behind the foot and pedal at 3 o'clock, then it's harder to generate optimal power. Muscle activation and pedaling feel. Queensland-based bike fitter Neil Stansbury suggests that if the saddle is relatively forwards, then the quadricep muscles will be facilitated and feel quite strong, and there will be good power delivery straight down on the pedal stroke. However, the hamstrings will be relatively disengaged, and at the bottom of the pedal stroke may feel like a dead spot. Thus, the cycling motion will feel like a stomping down on the pedal, creating a quicker onset of quads burn and an uneven torque delivery. He goes on to say that if the saddle is too far back, then this will overactivate the hamstrings, particularly at higher intensity riding, creating a burn in the upper part of this muscle group and potentially in the calves as well, as you'll be pointing your toes to get around the bottom of the pedal stroke. There'll be a corresponding lack of quads contribution on the downstroke. There is good research evidence supporting this point of view in this article, Muscle Force Strategies in Relation to Saddle Setback Management in Cycling. This study compared EMG readings of cyclists riding at 3.8 watts per kilo, which is a pretty solid pace, comparing their preferred 5 centimetres back and 5 centimetres forward saddle positions. You can see that the quadricep muscles are definitely working harder in the forward saddle position, and the hamstring muscles are definitely working harder in the backward saddle position. Phil Burt says that there is less overall power in the saddle back position as the hip extensor muscle group is less involved. He says you can't get your glutes into the game. The muscle activation chart only partially supports this statement because, as you can see, there is slightly less gluteus maximus force production in the rearward versus preferred saddle position, but there is definitely more gluteus maximus force production in the rearward versus the forward saddle position. Neil Stansbury tells us that on an incline of about 5%, if the saddle is too far back, then the pedal stroke will start to feel choppy. Steve Hogg, who is an Australian bike fit legend, tells us that if the saddle is too far back and you are cycling on a moderate incline, that you will need to get out of the saddle earlier because you will lose power in the pedal stroke. We will come back to Steve a few more times because he has plenty more to offer us. Joint pain and strain, the knee. One of the biggest arguments for not pushing the saddle too far forwards is to prevent strain at the knee, particularly at the patellofemoral joint. I'm a physio, and my profession has a long-held belief that pain in the region behind the kneecap comes from excessive repetitive load where there is increased knee flexion. Phil Burt subscribes, saying that a forward saddle position can cause increased patellofemoral compressive force and lead to knee pain in this area. However, 2 studies show that a forward sitting position was not associated with an increase in patellofemoral compressive force, refuting the idea that bringing the saddle forward is bad for the knees. These same studies showed that a backward sitting position increased the shear and compression forces through the tibiofemoral joint, so moving the saddle backward may be bad for the knees. A more forward saddle position will open the hip at top dead centre, and most of us would assume that this would help to reduce hip impingement issues, and moving the saddle back would close the hip angle and increase the likelihood of hip impingement. However, there is an intriguing counterintuitive theory about hip impingement presented by Cara Lewis and Shirley Sarman, both esteemed physical therapist researchers. They propose that when the hip is in a more extended position, in other words, more open, that there is an increased activation of the muscles at the front of the hip, particularly the upper quadriceps and the tensor fasciae lata, and this pulls the head of the femur forwards and upwards, which is an undesirable outcome contributing to hip impingement. To counteract this unwanted force, if the hip is more closed or flexed, then the large rear gluteal muscles are in a better position to pull the head of the femur backwards into the socket. So although moving the saddle back will close the hip angle and bring your hip nearer to the end of flexion range, it will also hold the ball in a better position in the socket and reduce the likelihood of impingement. Lower back. Phil Burt says a saddle which is too far back may be associated with lower back pain due to the increased spinal curvature to help you reach the handlebars and due to tightness in the hips because of the forward-leaning position. Upper body load and hand pressure. UK-based bike fitter James Thomas talks about a forward saddle position causing forward weight shift on the bike, increasing the pressure on the hands, potentially causing hand numbness and neck and shoulder strain. In his book, Phil Burt adds that sitting too far forwards can lead to specific hand problems such as ulnar neuropathy, which is pins and needles and numbness on the little finger side of a hand. Neil Stansbury agrees that with the saddle more forwards, there's more chance of hand numbness, neck pressure and soreness, and also triceps fatigue from the arms doing more support work. But he says that the reason for this is not just about the weight shifting forwards, but more so because of the hamstrings being disengaged and less able to control the pelvis. I think this is an interesting rationale, and I believe it does play a part, but I'm not sure how much. Steve Hogg's contribution is to say that you should not have too much pressure in your hands when you are riding hard in the drops. He says that your arms should just be relaxed props with the emphasis on relaxed. He says that the harder you ride on the flat, the less load your arms should be supporting, and this idea sets us up for the balance test that we will come to shortly. Body proportions and body weight. James Thomas points out that if you have a longer torso or you are heavier in the upper body, then you will need your saddle further back to maintain the appropriate balance point, and this in turn may require a shorter stem and a smaller drop to the handlebars. Steve Hogg presents similar info but slightly more nuanced, describing effective torso length. As a rider with a long torso who is hunched over on their bike will have a centre of gravity fairly close to their hips, whereas a rider with a short torso who rides with a very elongated straight spine, their centre of gravity will be further in front of their hips. Basically, the further your centre of gravity is in front of your hips while cycling, the further back your saddle will need to be. Saddle pressure. Many bike fit commentators say that saddle discomfort is usually due to poor saddle position rather than poor saddle selection. Of course, the wrong saddle will never feel comfortable in any position. However, a saddle which is uncomfortable to start with could feel significantly better when the position is optimised. Neil Stansbury suggests that if your saddle is too far forwards, you will try and slide back on it regularly while riding. However, if it is too far back, you will find yourself creeping forwards on it. Phil Burt states this differently, saying that if the saddle is too far back, then the rider will be constantly shuffling back on their saddle as the body will be trying to adopt the better biomechanical position, which is slightly more forwards. However, this is not a comfortable part of the saddle to be riding on. Burt also brings up the issue of chafing, saying that if the saddle is rubbing against your inner thigh, you probably need to move it a little further backwards to give your legs more clearance where the saddle is narrower. In this article by Krause and Schade, using KOPS as a starting point for saddle setback, they found that even with adjustments up to 10 millimeters forwards and backwards, 2/3 of participants did not move their pelvis. In other words, even though the saddle moved, the pelvis did not. This data all seems to agree that if you have your saddle set back wrong, but your body knows where it wants to pedal from, that you will likely end up with your pelvis on the wrong part of the saddle. Daniel Schade appears again in the Cycling Science book, saying that many cyclists mount their saddle too far backwards, increasing the reach to the handlebars, and thus they end up sitting at the front of the saddle on the nose, focusing the pressure on that front pubic region, which nobody wants. In the book, he shows an example of a saddle pressure map where the pressure was highly focused and then substantially redistributed with just a 5 millimeter forward movement of the saddle. The weight of the pelvis was then spread over a much greater surface area. The balance test. This is the most important part of today's video. This test is usually attributed to Steve Hogg. Amongst bike fitters, it's casually referred to as the Steve Hogg balance test, and it's described in detail on his website. Hogg states that the reason why this test is so important is that postural stability is the prerequisite for effective movement. I have to say that this is a fundamental concept in physiotherapy schools as well, and the basis for understanding childhood motor development and neurological impairments. In relation to this postural stability, Hogg writes, "The only way possible on a UCI legal bike is to have our seat set back the minimum distance behind the bottom bracket that allows the rider to cantilever their torso out from their pelvis without excessive enlistment of upper body muscles, arms and shoulders to support the weight of the torso. The position should be largely self-supporting. That way the rider can devote as much effort as possible to propelling the bike and minimal effort to maintaining a position on the bike." He goes on to say that this also helps relaxed and unlaboured breathing, which obviously is important for success in cycling and any endurance sport. To perform Steve Hogg's balance test, sit on your bike on an indoor trainer and get well warmed up. Increase your effort to around 85% of maximum heart rate and get your pedalling cadence to around 100 RPM, and your hands will need to be in the drops. When you are ready, swing your arms back so that they are alongside your hips. Ideally, you should be able to teeter at the point of balance without arching your back, without raising your torso, or without toppling forwards. If any of these things happen, it's a failed test. Hogg notes that cleat position, handlebar reach, and handlebar height will all affect this test outcome. He believes that the primary benefit of this balance test is that it gives a result specific to each cyclist, taking into account things like upper body weight, effective torso length, strength, and flexibility. Riding out of the saddle. I think that this is an underappreciated element of bike fitting and one that deserves more attention. Steve Hogg prefers to set the saddle as far forward as practical, subject to his balance test, so that a transition to an out-of-saddle effort, sprinting or climbing, can be smooth and rapid without a big shift in the rider's centre of gravity in relation to the bike. Bontrager says that when you are sprinting with your hands in the drops and pushing at maximum effort, if your bike has been set up with the saddle relatively far back, then your knees are in danger of striking the handlebars because they will be relatively closer to the pedals. Conversely, if your saddle is too far forwards when sprinting, it can actually interfere with your leg motion as your bike is pushed side to side. Bontrager adds that the most economical climbing position is when the centre of gravity is balanced directly over the pedal spindle when the front crank is horizontal. This allows the full body weight to contribute to downward pedal motion. He said that if the saddle and the handlebars are positioned too far back, then the arms will end up too close to the body while climbing and bike control will be reduced. Bike handling. Neil Stansbury points out that if the saddle is positioned too far back, there will be less traction on the front tyre and it may feel skittish through corners. I'd equate this to understeer in a car. He also says that if you sit upright while riding in a straight line with your hands off the handlebars, then the bike will feel like it's wandering away from you. Logically, he then says if the saddle is too far forwards, there will be less weight on the rear tyre and that may feel skittish when cornering. But in this case, if you did the hands off the handlebars test, you should still feel in control of the bike as the front end is more planted. Phil Burt in his book agrees that if the saddle is too far back, then the handling will feel lighter and this can be dangerous when descending through corners rapidly. Summary. I am so glad that you have made it this far. I know that I've presented a huge amount of information, but thankfully now, here is my executive summary. If we start to collate all of this research data and expert opinion, then we can start to see why we might choose either a relatively forward saddle position or a relatively rearward saddle position. So the benefits of the saddle being more forwards. More quadriceps activation. Kneecap pressure may not be as big of an issue as once thought. Less compression and shear force on the tibiofemoral joint. Less chance of lower back pain due to being overstretched and arched. Opens up the hips. Less chance of overstretching the arms and shoulders. More likely to have the weight evenly distributed on the saddle. Easier and smoother transitions to an out-of-saddle effort. Less chance of the knees striking the handlebars when out of the saddle. Better control of the bike with out-of-saddle climbing. And better traction over the front wheel with improved safety and handling through corners. And the benefits of the saddle being back further. Better engagement of the hamstrings, better muscle recruitment to minimise hip impingement, less pressure on the hands and less likelihood of hand numbness, less chance of neck, shoulder and tricep strain, some research evidence to show increased pedalling effectiveness. It's a better option if you are heavy set or you have a long effective torso length. There's less chance of chafing your legs against the saddle, less chance of saddle interference with out-of-saddle efforts, and better traction over the rear wheel where drivetrain power is transmitted. In terms of do-it-yourself options, Neil Stansbury suggests moving the saddle as far forward as you can go without failing the Steve Hogg balance test. Stansbury's suggested process is to start with your saddle all the way back and then slowly creep forwards 5 millimeters at a time until these conditions are no longer met, and then move the saddle back just a little. Clearly he believes that a more forward saddle position provides a superior outcome. Now just make sure that any change in saddle fore and aft is done with the appropriate change in saddle height to maintain the distance to the bottom bracket. Stansbury says that there is a 3 millimeter zone of happy medium where the saddle is neither too far forwards or too far back. Phil Burt says cyclists can either be micro adjusters that need everything accurate down to the millimetre, or they might be macro absorbers that have a much bigger bike fit window. And I tend to agree that the level of accuracy needed is probably different person to person. So this is my video. What are my recommendations? Taking everything into account, here is my recommendation for adjusting saddle setback. First, you've got to make sure that your saddle height is about right. If you need guidance on this, I've made a video on the subject which you can see here, and I'll put the link below in the description. Second, get on your bike on an indoor trainer, wherever your saddle is currently set up, do a warm-up and then start pedaling at a moderate intensity. Now, while you're pedaling, ask yourself these questions. Do I naturally feel like I'm on a comfortable part of the saddle? Do I feel like I'm bunched up or stretched out? Do I feel like my hands comfortably reach to both the hoods and the drops, or do I feel like I'm better off on the bar tops? Do I feel a lot of weight in my hands or a lot of effort around my neck, shoulder and arms? Am I feeling any numbness or tingling in my hands? And does this usually happen when I ride in this position? Do I feel like there's more work happening in my quads at the front of my thigh or in the hamstrings at the back of my thigh? Do I feel like there's any compression at the front of my hips, or do I feel like my knees want to go out to the side to give my hips more room? How comfortable do I feel when I'm riding with my hands in the drops? Once you have answered all of these questions to yourself, which will give you some idea of whether your saddle is likely too far forwards, too far backwards, or about right, then try the Steve Hogg balance test. See if the results of the balance test match up with your previous answers about your saddle setback position. If they do, move the saddle in the appropriate direction and retest. If they don't, then you need to work out what is your greatest priority. For example, if your hands go numb 5 minutes into this test ride or 5 minutes into any ride, then it's probably more important to move your saddle back to lighten the pressure of your hands on the handlebars, rather than saying, well, I completed the Steve Hogg test successfully, so I'm going to creep my saddle forwards 5 millimeters. We need to understand that bike fitting is frequently about the best compromise, and we need to work out what is the most important element of this process to you. Step 4 is to take the bike out for some test rides. Make sure you include some in and out of the saddle climbing, descending, sprinting, technical cornering. See how the bike feels and see how the bike handles. Based on the summary I gave you just before, you may want to make some minor adjustments to get the response that you want on the road in the real world. And don't forget that if a large adjustment is required, you may actually need a seat post with a different offset. Keep an eye on my channel for future bike fit content so you can gather more pieces of the puzzle, which will help you to simplify this potentially very complicated subject. If you've enjoyed this video and it's helped you, please give it the thumbs up. I'd also be thrilled if you would subscribe, because that will help me to grow the channel and bring you more content like this.